And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network. Well, in the bunker, the home, if you will, of the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And of course, we've got two motherships now, coalitionradio.us, where you'll see a tremendous amount of content, as well as our Civil Liberties link at the top of the menu. Old shows, commentary from a variety of politicians, national and local. And the new broadcast page, if you will, at coalitionradionetwork.com. For folks joining us for the first time, this is very much a work in progress. We moved into this facility in just a few short weeks ago. Obviously, the pace of what we're doing has been accelerated by the national crisis, as we see an opportunity here to engage in, as we like to say, outrage porn-free media. What is outrage porn? Outrage porn is when the media conflates issues, fires them up, use a tremendous amount of human emotion in order to get the almighty clicks. We used to say it was in order to get the almighty listens, to get that click on the car radio dial. Well, now it's all about the clickbait. And in doing so, they do a profound disservice to the American body politic at a time when we need accurate reporting, we need mature conversations, we need discussions, we need to come together as a country. We're already polarized to a degree that is heretofore thought impossible, even just, say, a generation ago. And all we're seeing, I think the second greatest failure, other than the Food and Drug Administration, in my humble opinion, is the failure of the media not to sugarcoat, not to be Pollyannish, not to mislead, not to obscure or obfuscate. But the media is intentionally taking every opportunity, rather than discuss the facts, rather than to use this incredible bandwidth, this brave new world that we have with the interwebs, as folks of my generation like to say. Instead of doing that, they're just pitching one side against the other. Anyone who knows me, full disclosure, I am the chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. This is an effort that is independent of that. But anyone who knows me knows that I worship at the altar of civil liberties, of free press, protection against illegal search and seizure, and a nation that looks to liberty free of governmental controls. I've got someone joining me on the line right now who I have a profound level of admiration for. His name is Mark Rutherford. He's an attorney, but he's so much more. He's been active in the Libertarian Party as a candidate, as a grassroots activist, as an organizer, as a manager, and when I say candidate, he most recently ran, I believe, for the Indiana Secretary of State. He is a graduate of the Valparaiso School of Law. He is engaged in private practice across a wide range of issues from, well, election law to general business law, defense law, and just about everything he is in between. He is currently chairman of the Indiana Public Defender Commission. And if you are truly a civil libertarian, you understand at a fundamental level how critical the role of a public defender is in a free society. Mark, thanks for joining us today. I know these are hectic times. We're all at varying degrees suffering through this. We've all got family members at risk at some level or another. But thank you for joining the coalition today.
Pat, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's great to be talking with you again and to see you again. It's been a little while.
A little while, yeah. I actually graced the shores, if you will, of Indianapolis just about a year or two ago, and got to meet a number of great libertarian activists there. It was a real meeting of the minds. I learned a lot, and I taught, as usual. I talked too much, but I also sat back and learned a lot that weekend. Indiana, interestingly enough, is a hotbed of the civil liberties and the libertarian movement. They have one of the finest affiliates in the nation. And tonight, this afternoon's discussion is really not a focus on being libertarian. I will say, though, that the conversation we're about to have about a lot of the laws that are breaking and the situations we find ourselves in are uniquely connected to the libertarian movement, because civil liberties is an altar at which libertarians, if I can be so bold, use this analogy, that we worship at. And so I want to frame the conversation that this is not a pep talk for the LP, but really a revelation of folks that so many people in the Libertarian Party are, like me, somewhat obsessed with these issues. What? Give me an overview. What's happening in Indiana? Since so many folks that listen to this are local.
Well, Indiana is not as bad as some states like New York, Illinois, or Ohio, but it does have the governor issuing executive orders. He's claiming it's under his powers in health emergencies. He's asked people to not work unless it's an essential business. If you look at the Homeland Security list of essential businesses, it covers a lot that is open in Indiana. And he also added a few things to that as well. The biggest thing is small business owners. They are taking it in the chin. And the restaurants can only do carry out. Luckily, they can also serve liquor if they have the right permit already. So that helps some of the restaurants. Movie theaters are closed, entertainment facilities, event facilities, etc. We all have to recognize that we're dealing with something that we really probably haven't dealt with since the Spanish flu. The one thing I'd like to mention is the problem with emergency orders is hindsight usually solves the problem that are created, but the immediate actions can be a big problem. Let's take the Japanese Americans who were put into basically prison farms during World War II. A lot of apologies since then, but at the time it was done. And that was all done under these emergency powers that the federal government and state governments will take sometimes.
You know, I believe that the root of the current approach, and I'll use that term with the coalition air quotes, really started during the Clinton administration. And what I mean by that is that the sort of new governing philosophy, I think, really took root during the Clinton administration. And that was we've been elected, and that's all we need. We are going to bowl our way through every situation. And constitutional requirements, or remember that the quaint times back as far as Gary Hart, where if someone was caught in scandal, they resigned because it was doing the right thing.
Yes,
all of that
doesn't seem to happen.
Right. All of that's gone, long since gone. So government now, and this is across party lines, by the way, government now seems to feel that once they are in power, regardless of plurality, regardless of constitutional issues, they're in power. And I'll give you a situation because in Rhode Island, we're sort of on the bleeding edge, if you will, of this crisis. Somehow it always comes back to Rhode Island, but that's another conversation. We've got a governor who, as recently, and it seemed to be, and it's almost quaint in retrospect, it seemed to be kind of a mini constitutional crisis back about a year or so ago, before the Supreme Court essentially ruled that sports casino gaming was legal. We have a governor who put sports gaming revenues into our budget, even though it wasn't even legal yet. And we have a provision in our Constitution which specifically says new forms of gaming must be approved in a vote, both in the host community and at the state level. And the governor, Gina Raimondo, the one who's on the forefront of the news right now, it just ignored that, put it into the budget, and just basically started it, signed a contract, and got the approval from the House and let it rip. Again, constitutional issues be damned. It's and at the time it was quite remarkable to a bunch of us because we realized that this governor, she's got her agenda and she's going to follow it. And the reality of the issues surrounding it and fighting a situation like that became apparent to good government folks, and became apparent to anyone who was anti-expansion of casino gaming. And the same thing is her approach in the legislature has been to approve the big issues, if you will, or to bury the big issues of the day. Big projects that used to require an up and down vote in separate legislation is to bury them in the budget. And this seems to be a problem that is nationwide because government is doing everything it can to remove the citizenry from the day-to-day decisions or the big issues. And that's from my perspective in Rhode Island. I was wondering if you saw that in places like Indiana or the Midwest where you so actively practice law.
Yes, I see it in other areas. I especially see it in Illinois. The Constitution of Illinois and the United States seems to be not taken very seriously in some areas of the state. Although there's a huge, the state's dividing in two between Chicago and the rest of the state. The rest of the state doesn't like these violations. Chicagoans tend to like them. They're, of course, a minority that does not like them, but that's part of the problem. But Indiana, for example, has a history of ignoring the Indiana federal constitutions. I'll be blunt about it. Governor Morton during the Civil War, he prevented the General Assembly, our legislature, from meeting for 2 years at least. He ignored the Constitution and ran it as a dictator. When the Ku Klux Klan had control of the government in Indiana, not for a long period, but several years, believe me, they weren't in the mood to enforce the constitutions, unless, of course, it favored them. So there are those issues that are out there. And the hard part about the constitutional issues is that if the people don't react, if they let things happen, if the people they elect will ignore it and they have suffered no punishment for doing so, then the self-interest of most politicians is to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's what concerns me about what's going on now. This is a very difficult situation. And in hindsight, we'll be able to determine what was done well and what was not done well, what rights were violated, where did the governors not go too far, and where did they go where they went too far. To me, the big test will be if governors went too far, will the assemblies, the legislatures, will the people demand that action be taken to prevent this from ever happening again? The basic rules are still out there. The problem you have, Pat, and this is Indiana or any state, is that the courts at the trial court level, which is the first level, they're very close to the political process. They're not insulated very well, if at all. And so that is where you tend to get the judges saying, well, the governor ordered it, we just have to abide by it. And then let me point out in Ohio, where the governor of Ohio postponed the election on himself, a trial judge says he can't do it. Well, guess what? The Ohio governor ignored that. The question is, what will the legislature, government, and people do after the fact to prevent that from happening again? If they decide it was fine, then guess what? Governors will get the message in Ohio. We can ignore the Ohio Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. And that's the problem that we have right now. I've got to emphasize that this has been declared an emergency. Again, judges are reluctant to second guess the executive in an emergency, including whether an emergency exists. This is what I say about these situations. Oftentimes, the only winners are the attorneys who are hired to litigate the after-fact damage where the government went too far. And that'll be a question that probably the U.S. Supreme Court, the Indiana Supreme Court, all the Supreme Courts or top courts of all the states will probably have to deal with. But the system is slow and deliberative on purpose at appellate levels. Whether that's right or not, that's what it is. And we may not have answers for several years about whether things went too far.
Is there any channel or any form of, and clearly I've watched way too many legal shows on TV, as has many of us, and there's nothing like a crisis like this to gin up all the armchair experts like myself. I like to say I'm not an expert, but I literally play one on the radio. Is there any avenue to injunctive release on this? Is there such a form as truly injunctive release on this?
You can get injunctive relief. Your best plaintiffs are those who actually have something happen to them. In Indiana, I only know of 2 situations where people have been enforced with either a misdemeanor or a ticket, which I'm not sure is a misdemeanor. One in South Bend, Indiana, one in Bloomington, Indiana, for traveling and have not a good excuse to do it. There were non-essential reasons why they did it. One was a guy who was really drunk. I've heard that he ran naked in the field after they pulled him over. The charge about violating the travel restrictions is really minor compared to the drunk driving charge. I think the police just did that because he probably honked them off. The one in South Bend, I don't know enough about. But I've had many people call me, and here's the bad news about it. As a lawyer, the ACLU, if they're interested, and they're getting interested in Rhode Island about the travel checkpoints between New York and between Connecticut and Rhode Island, stopping New Yorkers and probably other states as well, license plates with that. People try. is to stop that. ACLU might do it, but their model is one where they get paid if they win. They have lots of donors. So they have an economic system that works to do that. Mm-hmm. Lawyers for civil rights violations, we can get paid by the government if we win, but that's the big deal. And here's the problem, is that government fights it hard. They take forever. They throw all resources.
Oh, I think we, hang on, I think we may have lost you for a second there.
Is that
you're back.
Law enforcement doesn't know what to do in Indiana. So they're taking it pretty hands-off, except for the worst violations, and they're not arresting or ticketing anybody. They see 20, 30 people in a park gathered together. They ask them politely to break up, and most people are. Whether that's right or not, no one's getting ticketed, and that's the hardest type of situation to get a preliminary injunction. And to get a preliminary injunction, you have to show you're going to win, and you're going to have, you're highly likely to win, and you're highly correct on the law. And you have to show both. And so preliminary injunctions are fine, but in these type of times, trial judges often, very few are brave, and the brave ones get ignored. I'm just being realistic about it, and it's why people and citizens have to stand up and fight when they have these situations. Me being considered as a lawyer an essential traveler in Indiana means if I get pulled over, I just say I'm a lawyer. They say, hey, go on. So I don't even have standing other than the minor inconvenience, although it's a big inconvenience of being pulled over. Still, you have to have reasonable suspicion to pull people over. What they're doing in Rhode Island may not be reasonable suspicion. There's a lot of law about pulling people over for DUI checkpoints, which I'm sure law enforcement and the governors are relying upon. But does it really apply to this situation? I'm not so sure it does. But we're not going to find an answer on that right away unless somebody who has the experience, the might, and the financial backing like the ACLU takes this on.
We're fortunate here in Rhode Island to have an activist American Civil Liberties Union.
Yes,
they and we're blessed that they often join us on the show on a variety of cases that come before them. He's already made headlines. Stephen Brown, who's the director, he's not an attorney, but he is the director of the ACLU. He's already made headlines, actually somewhat internationally, by pointing out the challenges that this faces. And it brings into question really a central point. You know, and this is difficult because it varies by state, I assume. But what type of emergency powers does a governor truly have in this situation?
The best example is what governors tend to do in a tornado, flash flooding, horrible events, hurricanes that happen, fires from a forest fire, etc. Lots of cases on that. A lot of people go, and the thing about that is usually your emergency is pretty definite. You had a tornado, it's going to be bad, but in 3 or 4 days, you usually have the roads clear and everything's back to not normal to those who got hurt in the tornado or their property destroyed, but you're not having roadblocks anymore, curfews, etc. The same with snowstorms, where you have lots of snow. Those are pretty easy, but from the standpoint of what they have, which this doesn't have, is it's pretty clear to see when the emergency ends and how it will end. Most legislatures, including the General Assembly in Indiana, have lots of laws giving the government emergency power and giving him or her the discretion to do that. And that's where the problem comes in. And I want to go back to Rhode Island blocking people from other states from going in, questioning them, and if they say they live there, saying, well, you've got to stay quarantined for 14 days. That's my understanding of what's going on. There's a case from about 1940 or so. U.S. Supreme Court ruled upon it, and it's not exactly the same. Facts and circumstances matter, but it probably applies to this situation with the states trying to block other people. But we don't know until the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with me and other people. And that is, in 1940, California, progressive California, yes, right. They have a law saying that indigent people could not come into California. That's people who had no money, no work, no job. So a guy took his brother-in-law from some state, picked him up, Guy didn't have work. Guy was poor. Wanted to take him home to California with him, help him try to find a job. And he gets hit by a roadblock or something along those lines. And they arrest him for a misdemeanor for bringing his indigent brother-in-law to California. And the U.S. Supreme Court said you can't do that. Commerce Clause, that's Congress's bailiwicks. The right to go between the states is very, very clear. And also, indigent people, how are they going to get the law changed? It affects them. They don't live, how can they get the California state legislature to change such a law? Because they're not there to express their interests. So for those things and those facts, that's why the U.S. Supreme Court said that law was illegal and you can't do that. There's a lot of early case law where states try to have taxes and roadblocks and bar people from other states early in the history of the United States. Supreme Court, legislators, Congress put a squelch to that really quickly. So the question is it legal for Florida? Just did it on the Alabama border. Rhode Island doing it for at Connecticut, and for I understand people maybe with Massachusetts plates, definitely New York plates, maybe Connecticut plates are being questioned and told that if you're from New York, from what I hear, you need to quarantine yourself for 14 days. That's going to be a big issue, and that may be a lot of litigation. The problem is that always with the courts are a good place to percolate problems, but I use the word percolate. They take their time, and their first rulings generally may not be accurate until they go through an appellate progress. So we're all frustrated that there's not a lot we can do. We can try to do that if we have a lot of money. I know of people with a lot of money who are very upset. But usually when I tell a person like that, but you need first to get arrested or get a ticket before you have a really good position for what's called standing. Do you have a harm? Do you have a reason to bring a lawsuit, whether in the federal courts or the state courts? And so most people say, well, I really don't want that to happen. I don't want to spend a night in jail. I said, well, then we can't get the process started very well if you want to do that. And by the way, it's going to cost you a lot of money, and you may never recoup it.
So here we are, about a week or two into this crisis, and what do we do as a citizenry to rise up against this? I mean, is there in fact even a way to do it without literally confronting law enforcement?
Oh, there is. First of all, a lot of law enforcement are not happy about this. They see the same problems that I'm talking about, that other people are talking about. That's why in Indiana, they're taking a very hands-off on this. And so I know of no one other than this one situation, a rumor in South Bend, and an actual charge filed in Bloomington, but the behavior of the person as alleged by the police probably supports probable cause and being charged for something other than traveling during a quarantine as a non-essential business reason. Because if you read the probable cause affidavit, even if the police are halfway right, this poor individual has a lot of evidence against him that he was driving drunk. Of course, we don't know yet. He's innocent unless proven guilty. But you look at it and you go, this isn't where they randomly pulled somebody over and they found he was drunk. There's a lot of facts alleged that he was driving really drunk and when pulled over, hopped out of the car and ran through a field. So what do you do?
Right.
So what you do is be vigilant. Take care of your family. Take care of yourself. And if you are pulled over and you are given a ticket, the more people they do it to, the more people can pool the resources. So tell people if you get pulled over and you're given a ticket, or for whether it's what in Indiana called an infraction, which is a civil wrong. You can only get fined. In Indiana, misdemeanors and felonies are where you can go to jail. And Indiana has a lot of things that aren't misdemeanors that are in other states, for example. But if this happens, tell people it happened. Tell your friends. More stories may come out here. The other thing is, on Facebook, for example, a lot of people are talking about their experiences and their frustrations about certain things. Don't be an idiot. Don't be mean. But the more people who point out their frustrations, the more that the politicians see it, the more other people see it, that they know that this is going poorly, this is going wrong. And here's the other thing. This is all current. In hindsight, we all may go, this was an emergency. Or afterwards, in hindsight, we may go, this was an overreaction. All of us have our opinions on it, but the U.S. Constitution is not suspended. Your right to freedom of speech, your right to assembly is a big one. What do you do in a situation like this? We've had churches ignoring it. Most churches, and if you look at decision making, even if the bishops, the priests, the deans, the ministers, etc., the boards don't want to close down their church, for the short time they're looking, but it's not worth pricking the government and pricking law enforcement to do that. So I just know tons. I've got personal friends who are ministers, and they're running, doing what we're doing. For example, everybody's going. They have over 100 places on Zoom, and they're doing a Zoom religious services. What will happen if this keeps on going? That's a problem. And here's the other thing: if it keeps on going, and the people aren't convinced that it needs to keep on going, that's when you're going to have problems. I'm going to point out South Africa. South Africa has very, very draconian quarantines. They have a township there that's very rough and tumble. The people are not that wealthy, and they have been ignoring the quarantine. Whether it's a good idea or not, I'm not going to argue it. What I will say is that the people there are not following the quarantine. The army has gone into there, and what they do is they hide when the army's there, and when the army's out of there, they come back out again. That's worse than having selective quarantines, in my opinion. But it's up to the governors on their health emergency powers to decide what they think should be done. And so these are the things we're going to be looking at about how these were handled, where they were handled. If everybody thought this was going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks or even a month, I think a lot of people would have a different reaction to how my concern is, and the concern of respecting the U.S., in my case, the Indiana Constitution, which in many ways actually gets more rights than the U.S. Constitution. This is a great state for civil rights, is that they're going to be in a position where is this ever going to end? If you knew it's going to end, you can suffer some unconstitutional stuff a little easier. And here's the other thing, and this is what I saw in 9/11. I've been very active politically for a very long time. And that is a lot of stuff that was talked about is just necessary for what we need to deal with what was going on in 9/11 and terrorist attacks. It's become permanent. And so that's the real issue. Will people be screaming about this, or will they just accept it? And if you accept it and you think it's a violation of your Indiana and U.S. constitutional rights or your state constitutional rights, then it's going to be taking advantage of the politicians. Here's one thing I'm going to say. Everybody has their way to look at it, and the courts do, and their biases are going to be in there. I like to joke everybody's biased but me, everybody's prejudiced but me. But the reality is everybody has some. It's just the way we are based on our experiences, etc. But if you let the self-interest of the politicians, when they take more power and you think it's inappropriate, and you don't do something about it when the emergency is over by any stretch of the imagination, that's when you're going to have problems. ACLU is pretty good in some states, and I'm not sure what they're going to do about some of this. They're probably still looking to see if people are getting arrested or not before they take action in most states. Indiana has a pretty good ACLU as well. I don't see any activity from them. They're just kind of biding their time. When they're caught up, if they do stuff like that, then you're okay for having them used to do that to assist. Putting sandbags up in a river that's flooding for dikes, etc., things like that. Crowd control, you've got to be a little careful. Those are as old as me remember Kent State and the violations that happened with the National Guard in that scenario. But yeah, National Guard's available to help, but they can't, and they're not supposed to take on a role of controlling the people except for in times of massive civil disorder. So if they start checking our homes, seeing if we're quarantined or not, that could be an issue. Under most states' laws, that's the job for the sheriff and his deputies to do, or for the police department and his deputies, the police chief and his deputies to do, to see if there's a problem. It's supposed to be civilian and civilian only. The other thing with the National Guard is it leaves a bad feeling. It's bad enough if a policeman comes to say, hey, what are you doing and how are you doing? But you start having military, then we're going to be very concerned. Does that change the populace and how they view about things? It may do that as well. One thing that's very certain is most people don't want to get, in my opinion, involved in these issues. Most people will do what government tells them. Initially, there's always a strong minority that is like questioning whether we should do it or not. And the other thing is with COVID-19, it's undoubtedly a horrible, horrible type of virus that's out there. And for lots of people, it's an agonizing way to die. A lot of questions to be asked about that. So the question always is, what's the appropriate use of the emergency powers? And is this appropriate or not? We'll have a lot of litigation on it once things pass through. One thing that I would like to talk about is I'd like to talk about businesses. I'd like to talk about businesses and what businesses are doing. They're taking a hit. Their insurance carriers are saying that viruses and flus and bacteria are not covered. And that's going to be an area of litigation. Does that rise to constitutional issues? It may under the Indiana U.S. constitutions and the U.S. constitutions or the state constitutions of many other states. And why is that? Is that takings of property by closing your business down? It's going to be an interesting issue, and I believe that once this is done, you're going to start seeing that litigated from some businesses about, was this a taking, closing businesses down? And was it a taking by closing one business as non-essential, another business as essential? You might get some litigation out there about whether that was a taking of government when there's really not a good argument to make one business essential over the other. Just very, very interesting things that are going on here. And here's the other thing. I just hear that Governor Cuomo is suing Rhode Island under the Interstate Commerce Clause. The nice thing about that is government has a lot of resources. They have a lot of attorneys that get paid the same amount every year, whether they're doing a lawsuit on one thing or another. So this is fascinating. And oftentimes, the best thing to happen on where constitutional violations are happening is when the governments themselves start infighting and start using the U.S. Constitution to fight things. And this could lead to Cuomo suing Rhode Island. This could actually lead to maybe a reevaluation of how they're doing all the other things. One thing I'd like to point out, and I don't know who's doing it correctly and who's not. I'm not into disease infections, how that works. I might have to learn a lot about that if I have litigation in the future about it. But I do know that you talked to about South Korea, is they spent more time isolating areas where there was a lot of problem and letting things go fairly much like normal in areas where the COVID-19 coronavirus didn't seem to be as deadly. So there's going to be a lot of hindsight on what should have been done. But I take it that with Cuomo apparently suing Rhode Island, or that's New York State, but Cuomo's the governor, and he's going to tell his attorney general what he'd like to do. And if the attorney general says no, he can hire his own attorneys. Indiana can do that. Very rarely done, but it can be done in certain circumstances. That might put the issues into light in the court system. I hate to say that. It's the way the court system is. It's the way a lot of government life is. If you're working poor, if you're the poor, if you're homeless, you don't have the ability to do a lot of things because it's just like, this is very complicated. Lawyers, they're doing it to send their kids to college, to eat, etc. Some make a lot of money. Some do just fine. Most lawyers do just fine. But it is a business. And so those people without ACLUs out there and other organizations that are out there, Institute for Justice for one, there's legal services organizations in Indiana, 2 or 3 of them that are out there. I don't know if they'll take this on, but they're really good at helping the indigent when they've got a problem with being kicked out and evicted and whether everything legally has been done about that and what the remedies and rights are concerning evictions and landlords who don't follow minimum basic laws on the property. So it's good when a very well-heeled entity, such as the state of New York, with lots of resources, is getting upset at Rhode Island. And so that might get the federal courts and the state courts beginning to think, uh-oh, we need to take this seriously. And that makes it easier for people who might get a traffic ticket or a misdemeanor charge saying that you were not traveling on non-essential reasons. That there might help them in their case later on and give trial judges in the state courts or federal courts the reason to say, yeah, I've got to be brave. I don't like this. I don't think it's right, and I'll do something. On the other hand, they do give a lot of deference to the politicians and to the executive. The other thing I want to talk about is religion. And on religion, can government limit how many people are there? The question with rights and how the courts look at it is the law, is there a government purpose that's legitimate for it? And is it a least restrictive mean? And is it being applied neutrally? So definitely if you said no religious gatherings over 10, but everybody else can go to their big party and high school ball in the Indiana ballroom, nice, great place for proms, and have 300 people there, you've definitely got a constitutional problem. The question from whether it's targeted for religion or not, is it neutral? Does it apply to everybody? So that's going to make it a little difficult for churches to say that they're somehow being told that it is wrong, that it's a violation of the religious rights. They then have to go to, was this really an emergency? Well, did it last too long? Every time you start digging deeper like that, it gets harder and harder to win at the court on that. The bad thing about all of this is, sorry, people. Pat and I are communicating by messaging here as things are getting fixed. The bad thing about all of this is you should all be going, wow, it's really hard to enforce our constitutional rights. It's really tough. Don't just sit back. Learn lessons from what this has happened. If you think things went too far, it's amazing how easy it is to talk to your legislature. I go to the General Assembly. I've been practicing long enough. I'm chairman of the Indiana Public Defender Commission. As a result, and the Public Defender Commission has representatives and senators from the Indiana General Assembly on it, I've gotten to know a lot of them. So they know me, and it's a little easier for me to go in. But I can go in, and I only use it if I really, really need to, very rarely, and just say, hey, I'd like to meet with so-and-so. And usually, even in a session, as long as they're not on the floor in debate or voting, they'll go, hey, I'll give you a minute, and be well prepared. Don't take more than 60 seconds. But if you're well prepared, the good elevator speech has changed legislators' minds. Not always, but it does. Committee hearings, especially in the state, it's harder in Congress, but in the states, you can go there. And I've seen it happen where somebody goes in, excuse me. That's my allergies. Those did not go away despite the emergency order. You can go into the committee hearings, and I've literally been at committee hearings where I literally almost saw light bulbs go off the heads of the legislatures on the committees. And it's like somebody brought a point they had never thought of. It was from the citizenry. It takes 60 seconds, and it does change things. Not all the time. A lot of times it doesn't. But enough that citizens should consider speaking up. Even more importantly, is go to whatever your county, town, city, excuse me, a little frog in the throat, and your city boards. Lots of them have a time for the public to speak. And they listen. Sometimes they don't care. It's amazingly how many times that they do care. And so that's very important to do that as well. And I highly recommend that you consider doing that. That's how you change things about going on. Don't be afraid to talk. Don't get angry. Be respectful and just say your piece in 60 or 90 seconds. Don't be long-winded. Anybody who's an advocate, anybody who studies advocacy knows the shorter, more succinct, and more prepared you are, the more likely people will listen to it. Best way to lose a county commissioner listening to public comments is to try to take more than the 2 minutes they authorize. I go to a lot of school board meetings for various reasons, and the most effective citizens I've seen of all types and all backgrounds are those who just go 30 seconds, make their point. They usually make a real good point because they've thought about it. Those that are least effective, they're being told to sit down after 2 minutes. So that's something that you need to consider as well and to do as well. Now we've got an interesting question, and the question that's come up is, what legal recourse do we have to put the FDA and CDC out of business before the next pandemic? Well, that's a political one. Do you have rights to sue? You might be able to sue under the civil rights laws about it. You're going to have to say that they really blew it. The courts, though, basically try to fall back on one thing. And what they fall back on is it's a political question. It's up for the legislature and executive to work out and solve. We'll only interpret what their solution is and whether it's constitutional or whether they're following the laws that exist. So courts are reluctant to get into that. But here's the thing. If you think the FDA and the CDC blew it, I think from testing, my personal opinion is, I think there's a good case to be made that they really blew things when it came to testing for the COVID-19 virus. Speak up. Mention it when your congressman or woman has a town hall meeting. Show up. Take 30 or 45 seconds and saying, what is Congress doing about the FDA and CDC who blew testing for the coronavirus COVID-19? If you say that and ask that question, sit down, let them answer. If they avoid the answer, then you've won already. Everybody in that room heard it and heard them avoid the answer. If you get a direct answer, you've won. And you've won too. Suing them, that's a monumental taking. Your best bet is a good way to deal with it, and you can, but it's going to be costly, and they're going to throw tons. Believe me, if you think the state government has a lot of lawyers, wait till you deal with the federal government. They have a lot of lawyers as well. And the federal government pays the lawyers a little bit better, although in Indiana, the state lawyers are paid fairly well. So they get more of the more experienced lawyers, the one with more academic credentials from law school. And so that's who you're dealing with if you try to go the legal way. The political way is usually your first way. My best example is when it came to the NAACP, and they're brilliant, in my opinion, brilliant strategy attacking Jim Crow laws and racial prejudice laws and getting the civil rights laws passed. It was a long-term strategy. It was decades in the making. And it was more than the legal part. The legal part was one of the things they tried to do to change it. There were a lot of things they did to do it. So anybody who wants to change this, the more that they can work to take apart and hope others take other parts, the better off you are. The court system, which I have to tell a lot of people, yeah, you're right, but it's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. It's not a unicorn. It's a difficult process. It has its rules. It has its good sides. It has its bad sides. But that's kind of the issue with that. But if you do not like the FDA, which I don't, and I didn't like the FDA a long time ago, I think the FDA is doing things that harms more people than helps more people. I know a lot of people who travel to Europe, have lived in Europe. I've traveled throughout Europe, and boy, they're much more reasonable in getting prescriptions and getting health care, et cetera, and stuff on the market. And this is stuff that, yeah, testing, there's a reason. I understand why the FDA was created, because there was some huge abuses, but mission creep went too far, and I think now it harms more people than it helps. So tell your politicians about it. Keep up on it. Keep talking about it. Write letters to the editor. Some newspapers will print them. They want things to print. They want a contrary view. Again, don't be angry. Don't be mean. Don't call somebody horrible. Don't libel them. Don't slander them. Just be direct and to the point and make your point. That's a very important thing to do. So a question that I have right now is, does it really come down to winning elections? Well, yeah. The court system, like I said, and gave the example of the NAACP and how they challenge unconstitutional actions of different states, how they challenge unconstitutional actions of the federal government. They also had lobbying. They had local organizations that were doing marches, following mostly the Gandhi method of we'll do what we peaceably can or allowed to do legally, and watch law enforcement do the illegal stuff, and eventually they'll come around and see why it is we're doing what we're doing. Those are all things that are great, but coming down to winning elections it's amazing how much influence I have on public defense in Indiana from a libertarian perspective. Why is that? I've been on the Public Defender Commission since 2007. I've been on there now for, my goodness, 14 years. 14 years. There's one other person on there who's been on there as long as I have. We were appointed at the same time. We have a lot of influence because people look at us because we have an idea how things have been set up, why, etc. But when you're elected the chairman, you have to make calls, and my calls are from more libertarian bent. It can't be purely libertarian because I've got Democrats on the commission, I've got Republicans on the commission, judicial appointments, legislative appointments, gubernatorial appointments, and and one agency that gets to appoint somebody. So you do have to work that to get to where you go. And if I'm too zany, then it becomes a problem. But I do give influence. And slowly and surely, I think that my libertarian beliefs have influenced positively, successfully, and with some compliments, other people. And they get to see that there are other ways to do things. And the people in my commission, everybody's been appointed to it, have been wonderful. They've been great because they're all dedicated. The legislators, the gubernatorial appointments, the judicial appointments, all of them have been dedicated and understand the need to protect individual rights by having good public defenders when somebody can't afford an attorney to do so and help them in criminal justice system where you can be put in jail for a long time. And public defenders are getting more funded. I see statistics that are not definite, but Indiana Public Defender Commission has done a lot of work trying to say, how do we show our results? And we're beginning to see some things that suggest that counties that use our system, which is not mandatory in Indiana, 2/3 of our counties do it, and if they do it, they get a lot of reimbursement for the extra public defenders they hire to meet our standards. Those that do it, we're beginning to see that maybe having good public defenders reduces recidivism, or that is, people returning to the court system. And we're guessing on it, but we're doing a lot of research, a lot of statistical analysis, a lot of questions to try to find out the answers eventually. But our suspicion is that when you have a public defender, even though they don't have a lot of time with you sometimes, they're usually very good attorneys. Some of them are the best trial attorneys in Indiana, and same in the federal system. When you have somebody who gets to know their client, then if there's a conviction, if there's a plea agreement, they can, with knowledge, tell the prosecutor and the judge what can be done in the sentence to help that person not reappear in the court system. That's kind of where we're leading to. We're not 100% sure. We're confident enough that looks like it may be happening, that I've testified twice now on that to the legislature in Indiana, the General Assembly, and other people in my office, the senior attorney, and has done the same thing. And other people employed by the Public Defender Commission have done the same thing to say, hey, this looks like it's happening. Let's take a good look at it. This may be saving you money. It's just not directly, it's indirectly, because only the people we're afraid of are coming back to the criminal justice system. The people that irritate us, we're finding solutions so that we can help them maybe live their life a little better so they don't shoplift, etc. So that's a wonderful thing as well that's going on there about the Public Defender Commission. But it comes down to winning elections. And if you're there to make those decisions, and that's my point. I've worked real hard. I was appointed to the Indiana Public Defender Commission, but other people have been elected, and a lot of people have run hard in Indiana, have been appointed to offices because it's kind of like an interview. Even though you lost, other people need to find people for boards, etc., commissions, and they see that you're pretty good. So you'll be good to take a place. And in Indiana, most of our commissions and boards require that another party be represented. The majority party, either the county or state, gets to pick the majority of the board, but a significant minority has to be of other party. And sometimes libertarians, because we have ballot access in Indiana, we're appointed as the other party. The most important thing is, though, that we need to be unified. We need to put our energy to reach out to other people who are like us. We need to use good advocacy skills. A lot of the stuff I see on Facebook, boy, it really warms my heart, but it turns off anybody who's not yet to the point where I got to a long time ago. You kind of have to educate people. Just remember how I know things and do things now at 60 years of age, how I did them at 5 years of age. There is no way I could be jumped to that point from 5 to 60 in a month, or one Facebook message, or one Twitter message, or one email. You got to lay the landwork, get people to realize that, yeah, you know what you're doing, then you can go to the next spot. But you need to be unified. Let's don't attack each other. Those of us who are liberty-minded, whether you're involved with the Libertarian Party, the Republican Party, and yes, the Democrat Party. I have a lot of Democrat friends who are talking to me privately about what's going on, and the erosion of individual rights and it becoming permanent concerns them greatly. And other things concern them, like lots of money being spent for politicians' favors that really don't seem relevant to the COVID-19 virus. So let's try to get all those people together. And I talk to Democrats and Republicans who have a lot in common with me, not everything. And I just talk to them about the individual rights issues, and that's where we have common ground. Let's unify. Let's don't, in a Libertarian Party, let's don't fight each other on that. Let's work together to figure out a way to make sure that when the emergencies are over, which I believe they will be, just like 9/11, that the laws and the emergency provisions are not made permanent. They're cut back to where it was, and try to get our culture to at least where it was in early March. Ideally, I'd like to have it where it was before in August of 2001. But those are the things and goals that we go there. And I will mention one last time, although there was a lot of infighting, a lot of problems, there was a lot of work to unify the disparate elements and positions within the NAACP and other organizations that were fighting the Jim Crow law. But one of their successes, even though there was difficulties at times, was ultimately they worked together and they were unified. And in something that was so ingrained in the United States, especially the South, they were able to start undoing it. And I think that the children of my partners, her children, are going to wonder what was this hullabaloo about prejudice and Jim Crow laws. That's nice to see. Probably won't happen completely by the time I die, but it's getting there, and it's so much better than it used to be. Maybe the same way can be with individual rights and respect of the individual, and government only doing what it absolutely necessary needs to do and not taking advantage of emergency laws. So it's been a great time. Pat, why don't you send me a message? Tell me if we're about time to go. And I see that you're about to speak. You're going to give me a thumbs up when I'm done. Thumbs up?
Yeah, I just want to thank Mark for joining us this afternoon. We had a little bit of technical difficulty.
Waiting. He's typing a message as we speak. All right. I'm going to wait for a second, and we'll probably wrap it up when he gets done with what he needs to do to help conclude the show.
All right. Thanks, Mark. I want to thank Mark for joining us. We had a little bit of technical difficulty as we work out the kinks in this system. And, of course, a lot of folks are working from home offices that or let's just say are recent in construction. It's quite a different thing to go through some emails at home and process a little bit of paperwork. It's another thing to engage in teleconferences across the country when the web is actually finding itself mired in record volume. But most importantly, Mark Rutherford is an attorney widely respected for his demeanor, his fairness, his approach to the law, his knowledge, And when someone like him takes the time to point out the difficulties, the intransigencies of situations that we find ourselves in, it would be wise, regardless of our political backgrounds, to consider what he's saying. You know, there's a million cliches that apply. There's a million quotes from Benjamin Franklin that apply at a moment like this. But most importantly,
no,
as he pointed out,
we had a problem with Vimeo.
As most importantly, as he pointed out, when we looked at what happened during 9/11, when we looked at the Patriot Act that was a emergency response, when we looked to what ultimately was discovered to be widespread wiretapping of regular citizens, of anybody, and that these emergency procedures, much like, say, a special sales tax, and that comment will have resonance amongst my fellow Rhode Islanders, they never go away. The slowly boiling frog, the mission creep that is government, they never dial it back. So while we're all concerned about the health and the circumstances surrounding this crisis, we must not ease up on the pedal, ease up on the boot of government to maintain our so dearly fought for civil liberties. I can think of no public tragedy, as deep even as this one is, that's worth sacrificing the Constitution for. There's just not. And it so often is the case, and the jury's still out, obviously, on this one. It always seems to end up that the sacrifices we make result in little or no gains, are superficial in nature, yet bear deep consequences on the country, on the body politic, on the citizenry as we move forward. And this is clearly the case. Mark can't hear me right now, but Mark, I want to thank you. We'll send you, clear up the tape a little bit and put this up on the interwebs. And it's a call. It's a call to all of us that as much as we must be vigilant as to the crisis, we must wash our hands. We must engage in all of those behaviors. So simple. We must be equally vigilant in maintaining our civil rights and our civil liberties. We're going to take a break for a little bit, clear up our technical difficulties. We're going to have programming on and off. We're going to get into a regular schedule this week. A little bit hectic finding and contacting people outside of normal work channels to get them to come on the air. This is what happens. We're running this on the fly. This is very much sort of a pirate approach to media right now. But we need as many voices as possible, particularly from people like Mark Rutherford. Stay tuned. We'll be back later on this afternoon. Thank you.